Caleb Holt's ranch sat 3 miles from town, far enough that most folks forgot it existed. He preferred it that way. The house stood weathered and gray against the Montana plains, smoke rising thin from the chimney on cold mornings, then nothing. Just silence and wind and the kind of emptiness that settles into a man's bones when he stops fighting it. He hadn't spoken a full sentence in months. Not since the winter his wife bled out on the birthing bed and the child never drew breath. The midwife had tried to say something comforting afterward, something about God's plan, but Caleb just stood there in the doorway, blood on his hands, staring at nothing. She left. Everyone did, eventually. After that, the ranch became a place to endure, not live. He worked because cattle needed feeding. He ate because his body demanded it. He slept in short, broken stretches, always waking to the same hollow ache in his chest. Grief wasn't something he carried. It was something he lived inside, fenced in like diseased cattle, quarantined from the rest of the world. The work kept him moving. Mending fence lines. Chopping wood. Hauling water from the creek even when ice formed at the edges. His hands stayed busy, but his mind stayed locked in that room where everything ended. He didn't pray anymore. Didn't see the point. Then came a frostbitten dawn in early November, the kind of cold that turns breath to fog and makes every step crunch loud against frozen ground. Caleb opened his door to check the sky, and stopped. 3 bodies lay curled on his porch. A woman. 2 children. Wrapped together in a single blanket worn so thin he could see their breath pushing through the weave. They weren't moving, and for one terrible moment, he thought they were dead. Then the woman's eyes opened. She woke fast, sharp and alert despite the exhaustion carved into her face. No tears. No panic. Just a quick assessment of where she was and who stood above her. She didn't beg. Didn't apologize. Just pulled the blanket tighter around the children and said, "We'll leave when the sun's up." Her voice was steady, but her hands told a different story. Cracked. Raw from cold and labor. The boy beside her, maybe 7 or 8, had boots tied together with twine where the leather had split. The girl, younger, slept curled against her mother like she hadn't felt safe in days. Caleb stood there, one hand still on the door. He should have told them to go. Should have pointed toward town, toward the church, toward anyone else. His ranch wasn't a refuge. It was a graveyard with livestock. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way the woman didn't plead. Maybe it was the boy's hollow eyes when he finally blinked awake. Maybe it was the fact that the girl reminded him of something he'd buried so deep he couldn't name it anymore. He stepped aside. "One night," he said. The woman nodded once, a quick dip of her chin that said she understood the terms. She woke the children gently, and they stumbled inside on unsteady legs, the cold still clinging to them like a second skin. Caleb shut the door behind them and stood in his own house, suddenly uncertain. He hadn't had people inside these walls since the funeral. The silence had been his companion for so long that voices felt like an intrusion. But the children were shivering, and the woman was watching him with that same sharp, guarded look, waiting to see what kind of man he was. Caleb moved toward the stove and started building up the fire. The children ate like food might vanish mid-bite. Caleb set out what he had: cold cornbread, strips of dried venison, hard cheese that needed cutting. The boy, Evan, tore into it with both hands, barely chewing. The girl, Rose, ate slower but just as desperately, her eyes darting between the plate and her mother as if asking permission with every bite. The woman ate last. Careful. Guarded. She broke the cornbread into small pieces and chewed each one thoroughly, like someone who'd learned to make meals last. Between bites, she watched Caleb the way a cornered animal watches a threat, ready to bolt, ready to fight, ready for whatever came next. "Martha Klein," she said finally. Not an introduction. A statement of fact. "My husband died 6 months back. Cave-in at the ore site near Silver Fork. They pulled him out 3 days later. Caleb nodded but said nothing. He'd heard of Silver Fork. Brutal work. Men went in desperate and came out broken, if they came out at all. Debt came faster than grief, Martha continued. Her voice stayed flat, emotionless. The company said he owed for equipment and lodging. Took everything. The house. The furniture. Would have taken the children if they could have sold them. The boy, Evan, stopped eating. His jaw tightened, and something dark flickered across his face. Too much understanding for a child that age. The girl kept eating, oblivious or too young to fully grasp what her mother was saying. We've been walking for 2 weeks, Martha said. Sleeping in barns when we could. Doorways when we couldn't. The town marshal ran us off yesterday morning. Said we were vagrants. She didn't ask for sympathy. Didn't seem to want it. Just laid out the facts like a hand of cards she'd been dealt and had no choice but to play. Caleb stood and moved toward the back of the house. Barn loft's warmer than the porch, he said. Hay's fresh. There's blankets in the chest by the ladder. Martha studied him for a long moment, then nodded. She stood, gathered the children, and headed for the door. Rose looked back once, her small face pale and uncertain, before her mother guided her outside. When they were gone, Caleb stood alone in the sudden silence. The house felt different now. Occupied. The air still held the faint smell of wet wool and wood smoke from their clothes. Plates sat on the table with crumbs and grease stains, evidence that people had been here, that life had pushed its way inside whether he wanted it or not. He should have felt intruded upon. Violated, even. Instead, he felt something else. Something uncomfortable and unfamiliar. Not quite guilt. Not quite loneliness. Something in between. That night, he lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling beams. He could hear the wind rattling the barn door. Could picture them up in the loft, huddled under whatever warmth they could find. The girl was probably still cold. The boy probably wasn't sleeping, too wired with hunger and fear and the responsibility of being the man of a family that had nothing left. Caleb had told them one night. One night and they'd be gone, and the ranch would return to what it was. Silent. Empty. But when dawn broke cold and gray, he was already outside, measuring lumber. He didn't think about it. Didn't plan it. His hands just moved, pulling boards from the stack beside the shed, checking them for rot and warp. By the time Martha emerged from the barn with the children, he was already cutting the first beam. She stopped when she saw him. Watched for a moment. Then, without a word, she started gathering stones for a foundation. The room started as a practical thing. Not kindness. Not charity. Just the logical solution to a problem Caleb hadn't meant to take on. If they were staying more than one night, and apparently they were, then they needed proper shelter. The barn loft was fine for drifters and hired hands passing through, but not for children. Not for winter that was coming hard and fast. He told himself it was temporary. A few walls. A roof. Something that would last until spring, maybe, when the roads cleared and Martha could find work somewhere else. Somewhere that wasn't his problem. But the work had its own momentum. Martha mixed mortar without being asked, her movements efficient and practiced. She'd done this before, Caleb realized. Build things. Fix things. Survive things. She didn't chatter or try to fill the silence with gratitude. Just worked alongside him, anticipating what he needed before he asked for it. Evan carried stones from the creek bed, his thin arms straining under the weight but his jaw set with determination. The boy never complained. Never slowed down. Just kept moving like stopping meant admitting weakness, and weakness meant being cast out again. Rose stayed close to her mother, handing up tools, sweeping sawdust, singing quiet songs to herself that Caleb couldn't quite make out. Sometimes she'd stop and stare at him with those wide, dark eyes, and he'd have to look away. She reminded him too much of what he'd lost. Not in appearance, but in presence. The weight of a child's gaze. The trust in it. Days blurred into each other. Framing went up. Walls took shape. The structure grew from nothing into something solid, something real. Caleb worked dawn to dusk, his body remembering rhythms it had forgotten. The burn in his shoulders. The ache in his lower back. The satisfaction of seeing progress, of building instead of just maintaining. And slowly, without him noticing exactly when it happened, the ranch changed. The house smelled like bread again. Martha used what little flour he had and made it stretch, adding herbs she'd found growing wild near the creek. The scent filled the rooms in a way that made Caleb's chest tighten with memory, but it wasn't painful anymore. Just a present. Plates were set for 4 at meals now. Not by his instruction. It just happened. Martha would cook, and the children would help, and suddenly there'd be food on the table and people sitting around it. Evan would talk about the rocks he'd found, the colors in them, how he thought maybe there was copper or iron. Rose would hum between bites, her feet swinging under the chair. Caleb didn't tell them to stop. He noticed the noise before he noticed the feeling. The sound of Rose laughing when Evan made faces at her. The creak of footsteps overhead in the morning. Martha's voice drifted through the windows as she hung laundry. The ranch had been silent so long that the sound itself felt like an invasion at first. But gradually, his ears adjusted. Then his mind. Then something deeper. He caught himself planning meals. Thinking about what the children might need. Noticing when Martha's shoulders sagged from exhaustion and adding wood to the fire so she could rest. Small things. Automatic things. Things he hadn't done for anyone in months. One evening, as he was washing his hands at the pump, he heard Rose singing inside. Martha was teaching her something, their voices blending together in a melody he didn't recognize. Evan laughed at something, and Martha shushed him gently, but she was laughing too. Caleb stood there, water running over his hands, and realized he was smiling. The feeling came then. Not all at once, but like dawn breaking, slow, inevitable, impossible to stop. He was no longer alone. And for the first time since winter took everything from him, he didn't want to be. The town noticed before Caleb did. He'd ridden in for supplies, nails, tar paper, a sack of cornmeal that was running low faster than usual now that he was feeding 4 mouths instead of 1. The general store was quiet when he entered, just old Patterson behind the counter and 2 women examining fabric near the window. The conversation stopped the moment he walked in. Not gradually. Not a natural pause. Just silence, sharp and immediate, like someone had cut a thread. The women glanced at him, then at each other, then busied themselves with the fabric again. Patterson nodded but didn't smile, his usual greeting absent. Caleb set his list on the counter. Need these items. Patterson read it slowly, his lips moving slightly as he went down the list. There are a lot of nails here, he said. Building something? Room addition. That's right. Patterson's tone was flat. Heard you got some folks staying out at your place. Caleb met his eyes. I do. Widow woman and 2 children, from what I hear. Martha Klein. Her husband died at Silver Fork. Patterson nodded slowly, pulling items from the shelves behind him. Shame about that. Hard thing, losing a husband. Harder still being alone with children and no means. He set a box of nails on the counter with more force than necessary. Luckily she found Christian charity. The word charity landed like an accusation. One of the women near the window spoke up, her voice carrying that false sweetness people use when delivering poison. It's good of you, Mr. Holt, taking them in. Though I imagine it's difficult, a woman living under a man's roof without proper arrangements. Caleb said nothing. Just watched Patterson add up the cost. Mrs. Brennan's been asking after her, the woman continued. Said she'd be happy to help Mrs. Klein find more suitable lodging. There's work at the boarding house. Room and board included. Respectable work. She's got work, Caleb said. Oh. The woman's eyebrows lifted. What sort of work? The kind that needs doing. The implication hung in the air like smoke. The second woman whispered something to the first. Patterson cleared his throat and announced the total. Caleb paid in silence, gathered his supplies, and left. But the damage was done. Over the next 2 weeks, it got worse. Men started appearing at the ranch, respectable men with clean shirts and rehearsed speeches. They came with offers dressed as concern. Proposals framed as solutions. Thomas Yates, who owned the feed store. A woman needs security, Mr. Holt. I could provide that. Good home. Stable income. Proper arrangements for the children. Robert Drummond, the bank clerk. I've been thinking of marriage. The children would have education. Mrs. Klein would have a name that doesn't invite speculation. Even Pastor Wells, widowed himself, spoke in soft, careful tones. Sometimes God's plan requires difficult choices. I'm prepared to offer Mrs. Klein and her children a place in my household. As my wife. It would end the uncertainty. They never said it directly. Never accused. Just smiled too much and spoke too carefully, their charity coding something harder underneath. The message was clear, either legitimize the situation or end it. Caleb heard it all and said nothing. He stood in the doorway while they made their pitches, his face blank, his hands hanging loose at his sides. When they finished, he'd nod once and say, "I'll tell her you came by." Then he'd close the door. But he never delivered the messages. Martha knew anyway. She'd see them riding up the road, see the way they sat too straight in their saddles, see the determination in their approach. She'd disappear into the half-finished room or busy herself with work that kept her out of sight. The pressure built like storm clouds gathering. The town had decided this couldn't stand. Not a widow and a widower living together, unmarried, pretending at something decent people didn't pretend at. Something had to give. Martha made her choice before dawn. Caleb woke to the sound of absence. Not noise, but the lack of it. No footsteps overhead. No quiet voices. No Rose humming while Martha braided her hair. Just silence, the kind that settles in when something's been taken away. He found the blankets folded in the barn loft. The tools they'd been using hung back on their hooks. The stones Martha had been setting for the room's foundation were arranged in a neat line, waiting for mortar that wouldn't come. No note. No explanation. Just gone. Caleb stood in the half-finished room as the sun rose. The walls were up but not chinked. The roof was framed but not covered. He'd carved marks into the doorframe without thinking, lines showing Evan's height, Rose's height, measured with a pencil stub one afternoon when they'd been playing. The marks were still there, permanent, accusing. He'd driven them away without saying a word. His silence had been answered enough. The work continued out of habit. He finished the room alone over the next 3 days. Mixed the mortar. Set the stones. Cut the shingles and nailed them down. The labor was methodical, automatic, his hands moving while his mind stayed somewhere else. The room stood complete by the 4th evening. Solid walls. Tight roof. A small stove installed in the corner with a chimney that drew clean. 2 beds built from pine, the frames sanded smooth so no splinters would catch small hands. A window facing east to catch the morning light. A room built for a family that was gone. Caleb stood in the doorway and stared at the empty space. The beds had no mattresses. The stove had no fire. The window showed nothing but darkening sky and the shape of mountains in the distance. He'd built it anyway. Finished what he'd started because that's what you did. You completed the work. You kept your word, even if only to yourself. But it felt hollow. That night, sleep wouldn't come. He lay in his bed, staring at the same ceiling beams he'd stared at for months before Martha and the children arrived. The house was silent again. Empty again. Exactly what he'd thought he wanted. He remembered his wife in those final moments. The midwife had stepped outside to give them privacy, and it was just the two of them in the dim lamplight. Sarah's hand in his, her grip weakening, her breath coming shallow and quick. She'd known. Had seen it in his face. "Don't let this turn you hollow," she'd whispered. "Don't let it make you less than you are." He'd promised. Had sworn he wouldn't let grief consume him. But he'd lied. Or failed. Or both. He'd built walls around himself stronger than the ones he'd just finished for that room. Had locked himself away so completely that when life finally pushed back in, messy and complicated and demanding, he hadn't known what to do with it. So he'd done nothing. Said nothing. Let the world decide for him. Martha had chosen her children over uncertainty. Had packed them up and walked back into a world that offered nothing but judgment and hard labor, because at least that was clear. At least that was honest. Better to scrub floors for pennies than live in the shadow of a man who couldn't decide what he wanted. Caleb sat up in the darkness. His chest felt tight, like something was pressing against his ribs from the inside. Anger, maybe. Or shame. Or the crushing weight of knowing he'd had something real within reach and let it slip away because he was too afraid to speak. He'd been a coward. Not in the way men feared, no gunfight or standoff or moment of physical danger. Worse. The quiet kind of cowardice that dressed itself as caution. As restraint. As respect for propriety. The kind that hollowed you out from the inside. Caleb rode to town at sunrise. He didn't shave. Didn't change clothes. Didn't rehearse what he'd say. Just saddled his horse and rode, the morning cold biting at his face, his hands tight on the reins. The mountains stood dark against the brightening sky, and the road stretched empty ahead of him, frozen mud crunching under hooves. He'd spent the night sitting in that empty room, surrounded by walls he'd built for people who weren't there. Somewhere around midnight, the anger had burned through the shame. Then the clarity came. Simple. Sharp. Undeniable. He'd lost Sarah and the child because life was cruel and random and some things couldn't be stopped. But he was losing Martha and Evan and Rose because he was afraid. Because he'd let other people's judgment matter more than his own heart. Because he'd been too much of a coward to stand up and say what he wanted. That could be stopped. That could be changed. The town was just waking when he arrived. Smoke rose from chimneys. A few early risers moved along the boardwalks. Caleb rode straight to the boarding house, tied his horse, and went inside. The owner, Mrs. Brennan, looked up from the front desk, her expression shifting from surprise to disapproval. "Mr. Holt. You're here early. Where is she?" "If you mean Mrs. Klein, she's working." "I don't allow." "Where?" Mrs. Brennan's mouth thinned. "The dining room needs cleaning after breakfast service." "But I'll not have you disrupting." Caleb walked past her. He found Martha on her knees, scrubbing the floor between tables. Her sleeves were rolled up, her hands raw and red from lye soap. Evan was in the corner, polishing boots lined up by the door. Rose sat on a stool nearby, folding napkins with careful, deliberate movements. Martha looked up when his shadow fell across the floor. Her face went carefully blank. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly. "Need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about. I made my choice. I'm making mine." Martha sat back on her heels, the scrub brush dripping in her hand. Around them, the dining room had gone silent. Mrs. Brennan stood in the doorway. Two other boarders had stopped eating to watch. The attention pressed in from all sides, heavy and expectant. Caleb didn't care. I built that room for you, he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended, loud enough that everyone could hear. For all of you. Not temporary. Not charity. I built it because I wanted you there. Martha's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Caution. Hope. Fear of hope. The town's been talking, she said. You know what they've been saying. Let them talk. It's not that simple. The children are mine if they'll have me. The words came out hard, final. Not because I'm trying to be decent. Not because I'm doing anyone a favor. Because I want them. Because the ranch stopped being a grave when you showed up and started being a home again. Mrs. Brennan made a small noise of shock. One of the boarders whispered something to the other. Caleb kept his eyes on Martha. I know what people will say. I know some of them will turn their backs. Don't care. I'd rather have their judgment than wake up every morning in that empty house knowing I was too afraid to fight for something real. He paused, his hands clenched at his sides. Not asking you to marry me. Not asking you to be anything you don't want to be. Just asking you to come back. We'll figure out the rest as we go. The silence stretched. Martha's grip tightened on the scrub brush, her knuckles white. And if the town decides we're living in sin, she asked quietly. Then we're living in sin. Caleb's jaw set. But we're living. Not just surviving. Living. Martha stood slowly, still holding the scrub brush. Water dripped onto the floor she'd just cleaned, leaving dark spots on the wood. Her eyes searched his face, looking for doubt, for hesitation, for any sign that this was impulse rather than conviction. She must have found what she needed, because she dropped the brush into the bucket with a splash. Evan, she said, her voice steady. Rose. Get your things. Mrs. Brennan stepped forward. Now wait just a moment. Mrs. Klein, you have an obligation here. I gave you work when. And I'm grateful, Martha said, untying her apron. But I'm done. You'll not find respectable work anywhere in this town after this. You understand that? I understand. Martha folded the apron, set it on the nearest table, and walked toward her children. Evan was already standing, his eyes bright with something that looked like relief. Rose clutched her stack of napkins, uncertain. We're going home, Martha told them quietly. Rose's face lit up. To the room? The one Mr. Holt was building? Yes. To the room. They gathered their few belongings, a small bundle of clothes, a cloth doll Rose had somehow kept through everything, and followed Caleb out. Behind them, Mrs. Brennan's voice carried sharp and clear. You're making a mistake. Both of you. Caleb didn't look back. Outside, the street had started to fill with morning activity. People noticed. Of course they noticed. A widower and a widow walking together, her children trailing behind, all of them headed toward his horse like they belonged there. Thomas Yates stood outside his feed store, watching. His expression darkened when he saw them. Pastor Wells emerged from the church across the street, his Bible tucked under one arm, and stopped mid-step. Two women near the mercantile whispered behind their hands. Caleb helped Rose up onto his horse first, then Evan. Martha stood beside him, her chin raised, facing the stairs directly. They're looking, she said quietly. Let them look. Some of them won't forgive this. Don't need forgiveness. Need them to mind their own business. A man Caleb recognized, Samuel Porter, who ran the lumber mill, crossed the street toward them. His face was set, jaw tight. Caleb's hand drifted toward his side, old instincts rising, but Porter stopped a few feet away. Heard what you said in there, Porter said. His voice was gruff, neutral. The whole damn town probably heard. Caleb said nothing. Just waited. Porter studied them for a long moment. Martha. The children. Caleb's stance, protective without being aggressive. Then something in Porter's expression shifted. Not approval, exactly. Something closer to recognition. Lost my brother in a mining accident 12 years back, Porter said. Left behind a wife and 3 children. No family to take them in. No means to support themselves. He paused. The town was really good at offering prayers. Real poor at offering help. They scattered. Never saw them again. He looked at Martha directly. You take care of those children, ma'am. However you need to. Then he nodded once at Caleb and walked away. The gesture was small. But it cracked something open. Another man, Jacob Reed, who'd lost his own wife to fever, tipped his hat as he passed. Didn't say anything. Didn't need to. An older woman Caleb didn't know well stopped sweeping her porch and called out, "God bless you, Mrs. Klein." Not everyone. Pastor Wells turned and walked back into his church without a word. Thomas Yates went inside his store and closed the door hard enough that the sound carried. The women near the mercantile shook their heads and moved along, their disapproval clear in every step. But enough. Enough people stayed quiet. Enough offered small gestures of support or at least refrained from open condemnation. It was enough. Caleb mounted his horse, Martha settling behind him, the children secure in front. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but it wasn't the silence of isolation anymore. It was the silence of people who'd made their choice and could finally breathe. They returned to the ranch together as the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning frost. The room stood waiting, solid and real against the side of the house, its fresh-cut timber still pale, the chimney pointing straight toward the sky. Martha dismounted and stood staring at it. Her hand came up slowly, touching the doorframe, then the window glass Caleb had installed while she was gone. The glass was clean. The door hung straight on its hinges. Everything was finished. "You did all this in 3 days?" she asked. "Had nothing else to do?" She turned to look at him, and something passed between them. Not romance. Not yet. Just understanding. Acknowledgement of what they'd both risked and what they'd chosen despite the cost. By afternoon, neighbors started arriving. Not everyone. But enough. Samuel Porter showed up with his wagon, bringing a load of firewood he claimed he'd meant to deliver weeks ago. Jacob Reed came with his sons, carrying a mattress he said his wife had been wanting to get rid of. A woman Caleb barely knew, Eleanor something, the blacksmith's sister, brought quilts and a basket of preserves. They didn't make speeches. Didn't explain themselves. Just showed up and worked. Porter helped Caleb install shelving along one wall. Reed's sons hauled straw for mattress ticking. Eleanor helped Martha hang curtains in the window, simple fabric but clean and whole. They worked through the afternoon, the room slowly transforming from bare structure to livable space. Evan carried tools and asked questions about joinery and load-bearing. Rose sang while she helped arrange the quilts, her voice high and clear in the cool air. Martha moved through it all with quiet efficiency, accepting help without shame, offering thanks without apology. They'd all buried something out here. Lost something. Survived something. They recognized the shape of it in each other, grief, loneliness, the brutal arithmetic of frontier life where one wrong season could destroy everything you'd built. They knew what survival looked like when it found you. And they knew better than to waste it. By nightfall, the room was complete. 2 beds, properly made. The stove installed and working, heat radiating into the space. Shelves holding their few belongings. A small table in the corner where Rose could do her letters. The room smelled of fresh wood and wood smoke and the faint scent of lavender from Eleanor's quilts. The neighbors left as the sun set, declining Martha's offer of supper with polite insistence that they needed to get home before full dark. They knew what they'd given by coming. That was enough. When they were gone, the 4 of them stood in the new room together. Evan tested the bed, bouncing slightly, grinning when it didn't creak. Rose had already claimed her corner, arranging her cloth doll on the pillow with careful precision. Martha stood by the window, looking out at the darkening land. "It's a good room," she said quietly. "It'll do," Caleb replied. "What happens now?" "We live in it." Martha smiled slightly. "That's simple. Don't see why it needs to be complicated." Caleb didn't promise forever. Didn't make vows or pledges about what tomorrow would bring. The future was uncertain, it always had been. Winter would come hard. The town would talk. Some would never accept them. Money would be tight. Work would be endless. But the room was solid. The stove burned warm. The children were safe. And for the first time since he buried his wife and child, Caleb Holt felt something other than emptiness. He stayed. Not out of obligation or charity or because leaving would look bad. He stayed because this was where he wanted to be. And that changed everything. The ranch wasn't a graveyard anymore. It was a home. Built by choice. Held together by people who decided that survival wasn't enough, that sometimes you had to fight for something more, even when the whole world told you not to. That was enough. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is choose to stay. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from the Wild West. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.